We've all heard the phrase food is medicine, but what happens when we really put nutrition head to head with actual medicine? From lowering blood pressure to easing anxiety, Dr. Mary Scow joins me to share where diet can match and at times even beat our prescription medications. A quick note before we dive into today's podcast. If you like what you hear, I would love for you to subscribe to Fueled Wellness and Nutrition, wherever you download your podcast. It would also be incredible if you take a minute to rate and review this podcast. Those things do matter and they really help us. I'm Molly Kimball. Welcome to Fueled, a wellness and nutrition podcast. I'm a registered dietitian and nutrition journalist with a passion to help people live their strongest, healthiest life possible. In my weekly TV segments and columns, there's a limited amount of time and space to cover everything, but there's so much more to share. This podcast is my opportunity to dive deeper into the topics you want to know about. Welcome to Fueled Wellness and Nutrition. I am registered dietitian Molly Kimball. We've got a very special replay guest today, Dr. Mary Scow, MD, PhD. She's our favorite double doctor who always brings truth and really just an unbiased insight. So if you were with us for that seed oil episode earlier this year, you know that she meets every question just in the middle. She's not taking sides. She doesn't come in with extremes. She's looking at solid evidence, giving us her honest consideration, honest interpretation of the science, and zero judgment. So I asked her to come back and join us because she's taken her knack for translating some of this nutrition science into things that we actually get. And this time she's done a whole deep dive, side by side, point by point, comparing diet, lifestyle, movement, those small things that we can control, the small things that are really big things that we can control. And she's looked at these side by side next to the impact that we see from medications. So from things like blood pressure to cholesterol, diabetes, mental well-being, you name it. She's looking at food and lifestyle. Where do these come into play? How do they stack up to prescriptions? And when does each really shine? And here's what I really love about it. This isn't about shaming medication use, or it's also not saying that nutrition can solve everything. That's also not the case. But it's about knowing our options, understanding the science, and realizing that sometimes the most powerful prescription doesn't come from a pharmacy. So if you're one of those that says, you know what, I received this diagnosis, or I've been struggling with this particular issue, but I really want to try lifestyle first. If you're in that team, or if you're one that's, you know what, you're already taking medications, but you're kind of starting to think, how can I stack the deck more in my favor, nutritionally, health-wise? This conversation will give you the tool to take charge of your health in a way that actually feels doable. So with that, let's dive in. Welcome, Dr. Scow. We're so happy to have you back with us.
Sounds great. I'm so excited to be here. Thank you again so much for having me on the podcast.
I love the blend that you have, this MD, PhD. So tell us, for those who weren't here for our seed oil conversation, tell us kind of how both came to be.
For sure. So I usually tell people that my interest in nutrition officially started with a science fair project when I was 16. And I was so just obsessed with nutrition. I wanted to know everything about it. I studied nutrition both in my undergraduate degree, and then I did graduate school. I did a PhD in nutrition. And I loved being, knees deep in the science. I always tell people PubMed is my favorite place on the internet. But during that journey in graduate school, I realized that I wanted to have an application for all of the knowledge. And I was a little bit frustrated with the notion that maybe I was going to write all these reports that no one was ever going to read. And I was like, how do I take this information to people who can use it today, right away? And that's what made me shift my focus a little bit. And I decided to apply to medical school. And my goal all along was that I wanted to be able to translate all of that nutrition science into clinical settings and do it from the inside. And that's what I'm so privileged and so thankful to have the opportunity to do today. And I'm so humbled and amazed at the appetite for nutrition amongst my physician peers. When I go to conferences now, all the feedback is like, we want more of this. We want to learn more about nutrition. We want to bring this to our patients. So I feel like the tide has really turned, and it's a really exciting time to be marrying these two really important fields.
Something that legislation that just passed here in Louisiana this past summer is that starting next year, 2026, providers will be required to have a minimum amount of nutrition education. The bill originally was positioned as annually. Now it's only one hour annually. But my gosh, I mean, that's still way more. And at least having the focus and the shift of providers need that nutrition information. And so an hour a year is not a lot, but it is at least better than nothing. And a lot of times, whether it's in med school or other types of, backgrounds, depending on what the type of provider is, the amount of nutrition that might be addressed in that schooling is really, really small. So having that focus now to at least have our head in the game as it comes to preventative nutrition too is huge. And so right now as we speak, we have like the breaking news that you're moving soon from Toronto to New York.
Yes, yeah, that's the exciting thing that's around the corner for me. I currently work as a locum tenens physician. So that means I take short contracts and I work in different clinics. And I love that because every clinic, every community has different people and thus different unique problems, which are interesting challenges for me and helps me grow my skill set and grow my, professional skills. So I'm excited to be joining a new clinic and a new community and to bring all of my nutrition information there.
That's going to be so cool. Do you know anybody where you're going? Because you're going to be living in, like you said, South Bronx.
Yes, I'll be living in the South Bronx, and my clinic is just about 30 minutes from there. I don't know anyone in the Bronx right now. I know a few people in and around the New York area, different people I've gone to school with and things like that, but it will be a new adventure for me, or I don't have any really strong connections in the city, although my family is originally from New York State. So New York State is a special place for me.
And we're going to be there in a few weeks. So hopefully you and I can get to meet in person. So when we're having this conversation about the impact that lifestyle changes can have and the impact that lifestyle changes can bring to certain in specific conditions compared with medications, you've done the side-by-side analysis. And this is something that you've presented, like you said, presented at conferences. It's something that you've had a slide deck and you've continued to build upon that. So we're going to kind of give the audio narrative of this for our listeners. Where do you want to start with this, the concept of this? Because I think it's one of these things that you're in a really unique place to help guide people in a very specific way, because a lot of times you may have two separate schools of thought. Our lifestyle nutrition team at our, that is works with me and we're guiding clients, we're guiding patients. A lot of times we're not in that same network with the provider. So they're seeing their provider, the provider saying, you need to start this medication. They're coming to us and we're working with them on the nutrition side. But a lot of times those two things, while we often do work hand in hand with the provider, there's a lot of times not. And so sometimes at best case scenario on our end is we will say with a patient or in the communications with the provider, can we have a window where before starting that medication, we can work with this patient to make these nutritional changes. And when that can happen, that is best case scenario. So you kind of know what's what, because otherwise you're starting a medication, you're making these lifestyle changes and you don't really know what's making the impact.
Absolutely. I totally agree on that last point that you just said about giving that time window to say, okay, we have this new information. Maybe your cholesterol is a little higher than ideal. Maybe your blood sugar is a little higher than ideal. But we know these things are reversible and these things change drastically with time. Like, for example, cholesterol is usually a measure of approximately the last 2 weeks. So if you just went on vacation and ate everything in sight and then you check your cholesterol, it's going to be terrible. But then 4 weeks later, maybe you've been home, more back into your usual habits, it's going to be a different picture. So I always advocate for taking another measurement, give yourself a little bit of time, make a few changes and see where your average really sits. And normally, with a few exceptions, sometimes, we do need to jump to medications, but often we have that time. We can wait. We can see how much improvement we can make. And often the improvements are amazing. I'm often impressed and surprised by how drastically people can lower their cholesterol just in a very short amount of time. How did I come to thinking about this? Well, to be honest, a lot of it was just born of necessity. I realized as I exited medical school and started, as a resident, and I started prescribing these medications, despite my own training in nutrition, I was like, well, wait a second, how do these two things measure up? I know that diet has all this potential, but numbers wise, is it the same? Is it half the benefit? And I will honestly admit, I actually myself underestimated the effects of nutrition. I had this assumption, of course, nutrition helps, but is it going to be as powerful as the medications? And then I started looking at the numbers and I was like, wow, there's a lot of situations where the nutrition option is just as effective. Is it as convenient? Maybe not. You know what I mean? But you don't have the side effects. So it's a trade-off. So I was very pleasantly surprised by looking at that evidence and making that comparison. And now it's just like a thing. Like every time I see a great randomized controlled trial that shows me a magnitude of difference, I'm like, okay, wait, how do I compare this? How do I make sense of this? So I can then communicate it to my patients in a way that's meaningful.
You bringing this to your patients is also perhaps that incentive they need, the inspiration they need to actually give it a go. Because as you said, medications can be easy. Medications, you take that pill, it's a quick fix, but you're not getting at the root of the issue. And then, nothing is without side effect. And so as you're taking one medication for one condition or multiples for other conditions, there's going to be other side effects that we're having. And also when we look at the lifestyle patterns that may be, cholesterol is an easy one for us to talk about, but that might be causing us to have, let's just say, high cholesterol. That's not the only thing it's probably causing. If we're having things that our nutrition is so poor that our cholesterol is high, it's probably also affecting our energy, our sleep, reflux, perhaps, hypertension. So there's going to be all these things, or weight, how we're feeling, that joint pain. So there's all these other things that maybe cholesterol is what's really been flagged when you're going into your doctor, but you've got all these other things that are really related to how you're nourishing or not nourishing your body. And so as you start to look at really dialing into addressing certain conditions with nutrition, it's really likely that you're going to see the trickle down effect and see it improve in these other areas. So, looking at it as a not just targeting your cholesterol, which that medication is targeting your cholesterol. This is things that can help you feel better across the board.
So what I always tell my patients is when you change your diet or your lifestyle, the only side effect is an improvement in every other area of health as well. It is really this investment that goes a very, very long, long way. And it takes some time, but I usually find it's always worth the investment.
You think about things that people experience, anxiety or sleep, they're not often even tying these in with nutrition and that nourishment, but all of these things do go hand in hand. So let's start with, you have a list that I've got in front of me that I think is fascinating. The first is blood pressure. So looking at nutrition strategy versus medications as it relates to blood pressure.
Yeah, I love talking about blood pressure and lifestyle. When I give this presentation at physician conferences, I open with a slide where I give them a multiple choice question. And what I say is, of the following 4 options, which one do you think will lower blood pressure the most? And the options are lowering dietary sodium, increasing dietary potassium, adhering to the DASH diet, or adding 4 tablespoons of ground flaxseed to your diet. And I show this slide and I get the audience to vote. And the answer is it's actually 4 tablespoons of ground flaxseed, which usually people don't expect. Now, it's not to say that all of those things aren't helpful, and all of those things are helpful and should all be done. But it's interesting because it shows that sometimes just a small thing can go a very, very long way. There is this beautiful trial where they gave people over 3 months, they gave them 4 tablespoons of ground flaxseed, and they measured their blood pressure at the start and at the end. And what they found was that adding those 4 tablespoons compared to baseline resulted in a 15 millimeter of mercury. That's the unit we use for blood pressure. A 15 unit drop compared to baseline and a 10 unit drop compared to placebo. So when you put that into perspective with medications, we know that an average single first-line blood pressure medication lowers blood pressure by about 15 units. So diet in that case is pretty much on par with that single medication. Now, to be honest, a lot of patients are not only on 1 blood pressure medication. A lot of patients are on 2, 3, 4 blood pressure medications. So sure, we can get additional benefits by adding additional medications on top. But when you're at that point where you're deciding whether to start that first medication, we know that diet can be as effective a strategy.
And so flax seeds, 4 tablespoons a day. How do you recommend that someone incorporates it? And would it be as effective if you're supplementing with flaxseed oil, or it's the ground flaxseed fiber and all in there?
Fantastic question. So when they look at that study, what they see is that as flaxseed consumption goes up, the blood level of omega-3 fatty acids goes up, and that's where blood pressure comes down. So they think that most of the effect is because of the omega-3 fatty acids themselves. That being said, Clinical trials of omega-3 supplements have not shown that benefit. We think that's because in a supplement form, those omega-3s can get oxidized. There's all kinds of challenges. The other thing is, it's probably not just the omega-3s. Flax seeds are such a source of so many vitamins, so many minerals, fiber, so many other things that are also helpful. So it's probably the package that those omega-3s come in as well. So we do know that that's probably why it's happening. Now, how do you incorporate them in your diet? A simple way is if you eat something like oats or cereal for breakfast, you just throw them in. You can combine them with yogurt. You can put them in your smoothies. Some people will put them in their salad. There's many different ways to work those in. And what I tell patients is, even though 4 tablespoons has been shown to have this magnitude of decrease, 1 tablespoon is a good start, or 2 tablespoons. Just work it in as little as you can. And, those small changes do add up over time.
And we'll also say the flaxseed, just make sure it's ground or milled, not whole flaxseed, because so it's ground or milled. Smoothies are probably the easiest, but 4 tablespoons in there. And like you said, even if you're starting with 1 or 2 tablespoons, but if you're doing something like a smoothie, 2 tablespoons in there, something like stirring it into yogurt or cottage cheese, it's just going to give that crunch. And especially if you're adding something like a lower sugar granola, you could add the flaxseed in with that. Tell us too about weight loss and also exercise as it relates to blood pressure.
Yeah. So diet, I always see it as one strategy in the setting of a larger toolkit of many different lifestyle measures. We know that exercising is going to bring your blood pressure down tremendously. Losing weight can do make a huge difference as well. Cutting out alcohol makes a huge difference. So it's always about doing as many things as you can and adding them in to get your maximal benefit.
So each year we do our annual alcohol free for 40 challenge, and we have people come in at the beginning of Lent and at the end, which happens to fall right after Mardi Gras here in Louisiana and the New Orleans area. And we're doing all these metrics. We're doing all these tests, labs, physical metrics, and blood pressure is one that we see significantly drops, systolic and diastolic, in the majority of the population coming through. And the same thing with weight. And so what I would say is, for our listeners, if you've taken other measures and, for different reasons, you've been improving your nutrition, you're moving more, you're losing weight, pay attention to that as it relates to your blood pressure, because a lot of times someone's making all these other changes and they don't catch up their blood pressure medication dosage. And so if you're feeling a little bit lightheaded or you feel almost like a low blood sugar reaction, a lot of times that can be low blood pressure if you haven't adjusted your medication. So make sure if you're on blood pressure medication and you're losing weight as you're actively making these other healthy choices, that you're kind of keeping your eye on that. Anything else that we would say? And I'll link to, I'll put in the show notes the information on alcohol, but I think that one's a really interesting one to see. The drop sometimes is so significant that people are able to, again, come off of blood pressure medications, not realizing just how much those couple of drinks a day was raising it. So it's some of those striking things we think are habitual, or we think they're not that big of a deal. And then when we remove them or we change them, we can really see the impact. So I think with all of these too, it could be something to suggest to someone giving it a go, trying it for a month, 2 months, 3 months, and seeing what difference this makes.
I couldn't agree more.
Cholesterol is next on our lineup. Do we have anything else that we were going to talk on blood pressure? I think cholesterol is next.
Totally. So cholesterol is something I check every day in my clinic for countless patients. I'm constantly getting those results rolling into my inbox. And cholesterol is interesting because there's this big wide range of numbers. And I often tell my patients, like, if you eat meat and dairy products, most people are going to sit in a range that is not optimal. But you don't necessarily have to go vegan. One of the best things you can do if you want to lower your cholesterol as much as possible is you take out all the meat and dairy products. Your cholesterol will go down to like 70. I have a colleague who's vegan, who's young in his 20s. His cholesterol is 30. It's like the level of a newborn baby. But you don't have to go that low. There's so many things you can do to bring it down to the level that's going to be right for you. And the thing I like to emphasize with patients here is there are so many foods that you can add to your diet to lower your cholesterol level. Sure, you can take out the butter, you can take out the red meat, the coconut oil, those sorts of things. That helps. But the other side of the coin that we don't talk about as much is, what do you add? And the most important foods to add are things like nuts, things like beans, again, flax seeds, oats, certain fruits like apples and berries. There have been beautiful trials that have shown that when you add these foods, you can significantly reduce your cholesterol level. And it's just as a result of adding the food, even if you change nothing else. Part of that is because a lot of these foods will actually bind cholesterol and prevent its absorption. So just by having them there, you're not going to absorb the cholesterol that is in your steak or your cheese or whatever else you're eating. So I think it's so important to focus on not just what we're taking away, but what we're adding. And the way that I show this to patients is I just have a one pager and I show them all of the different foods that when added to the diet lower cholesterol. And I have the numerical reduction, and exercise is on there too, because exercise actually lowers cholesterol more than any of these foods. And then the other key message here is the more of these foods you eat, the lower and lower your cholesterol will be. So I tell patients, like, start by adding one and then keep adding more and see how many you can add. And then we'll recheck your levels. And I've had patients completely drastically decrease their LDL cholesterol. They might come in, they're like 185, they're knocking on the door of needing that medication. A few weeks later, they've changed everything and they're like 110, 100, and it's night and day. And it's so impressive. And it's so gratifying for patients too, to know that it is within their control. And it's just simple changes that can make this big difference.
And again, changes that aren't addressing just cholesterol. They're going to also, when you are focusing on things like, beans, and you're adding these into your diet, there's only when you're adding in and you've got the emphasis on these healthful things, or you're putting more of into your diet, it's also edging out the other stuff, So when you're focusing on the positives that we're putting in, it's going to naturally edge out the added sugars, the other, fried foods or whatever that is, because there's only so much that, you're going to probably be consuming and it can take the place of. What is on that one pager that you share with them? What are kind of the list of foods that you would say are on the one pager that kind of go side by side on there?
So on that handout that I give my patients, at the top of the list is exercise. 45 minutes of exercise 3 times a week can lower your cholesterol by 38%, which for the average American is about a 44 milligram per deciliter, or 44 unit reduction in that LDL, that's bad cholesterol, in that level. There's this amazing study that shows that 1 cup of almonds per day can lower cholesterol by 30%. I don't necessarily recommend a cup of almonds every day. You could better serve yourself by eating a variety of different foods. We also know that 1 handful of nuts per day is of all different types of nuts, with the exception of peanuts, can also lower cholesterol. Soy protein is also very high on that list. About a cup of soy protein or soybeans per day can lower cholesterol by about 19%, or that's a 22 unit reduction. Barley is often a forgotten grain. 3/4 a cup of barley per day can lower cholesterol by 15%. Swapping olive oil for butter on average lowers cholesterol by about 12%. One of my patients' favorite options here is psyllium fiber. The same thing that often people take to improve their regularity with bowel movements also decreases cholesterol. And people like this because it's just a matter of mixing that powder into their water and drinking it. It doesn't require any food prep time. So that's an option. 2 cups of berries is a lot of berries. So just incorporate some berries when you like, but 2 cups could lower cholesterol by 7%. Chickpeas, beans, lentils, legumes, all of those foods, 3/4 of a cup per day lowers cholesterol by about 6%. If you eat your cup of oats for breakfast, you get a reduction of 6%. 2 apples per day can lower cholesterol by 6%. That handful of nuts is about a 4% reduction. And finally, the flax seeds that you've added to your diet for your blood pressure are also going to lower your cholesterol a little bit by about 1.5%. So that's just about giving patients as many options as possible so that they can then add whatever makes sense for them in the context of their diet.
And you did say you did want to acknowledge that higher doses of something like statin medications can be significant. And there's always going to be a time that somebody does need these. So we don't want to discount that. But there's so many times the medications are prescribed, the statins are started without that true lifestyle change going into effect.
Absolutely. The trials that have taken these foods and put them together into a diet, it's sometimes called the portfolio diet because there's a portfolio of different cholesterol lowering foods, on average has been shown to lower cholesterol as much as a low dose statin medication. So that first dose that we're going to give people for primary prevention of heart disease or for just that high cholesterol level, diet can do the same job. But if you've had a heart attack, if you need that high dose statin is going to have a greater effect. I'm here to say diet doesn't always beat medication. Sometimes medications are stronger and more potent, but it just depends on who you are and where you're at and what you need.
So for me personally, I've done a podcast with one of our cardiologists, Dr. Carl Levy, and we talked, deep dive on cholesterol and also specifically LDL cholesterol. So for our listeners, I'll also link back to that because he he included too, if your LDL is high, let's look at these other tests and these other markers to see how much do we need to be concerned about that elevated LDL. And so if our listeners have heard that before, that episode before, I shared my own. And so over the years, my LDL has been inching up. So from the low 100s to 120s, 130s, 140s, it's been hovering in the 160s, 164, and it was only going up. And so, I was really concerned about it. I talked with my primary care and the cardiologist, Dr. Levy. He's not my cardiologist. It wasn't to the point where I needed a cardiologist, but he's who I turned to for interviews on this podcast, expertise and guidance. And, my primary care and I talked about it. We also looped him into the conversation, and both of them agreed. They said, we did all the other tests that also Dr. Levy and my primary care doctor recommend, the lipoprotein little a, et cetera. So if you want to know more about that for our listeners, I'll link to that whole episode. We did all those other markers and everything came out to say there's not anything to be concerned about with your LDL as it is. Both of them, though, said, Molly, because I was resistant to taking a medication, a statin, and they said, prepare yourself. If and when it gets to the 190s, we're going to be pretty adamant that we think that you should start taking a statin. I thought, why am I going to just wait? Because the lifestyle changes, I exercise regularly, daily, and pretty intense exercise, at least, getting a heart rate up for a nice amount of time. Nutritionally, my diet is very low in animal fats, high in fiber, low in, white refined. So all the things nutritionally, I felt like I'm doing a pretty good job on that. And also just, that's just sort of what my lifestyle is. I had given it a snippet of time too, that I said, let me reduce those animal fats even more. So things like that half and half splash in my coffee, I went plant-based, everything. I went, just really vegan for that period of 3 months, and there still wasn't a drop. So I thought, I'm putting real half and half, going back to that in my coffee, and, and still budged and really didn't really make a difference either way. And so I started red yeast rice, and pretty low dose, 600 milligrams. And I started that, as you and I are talking right now, it's August. I started it last October. And within 2 months, it had gone from the 160s to the 130s. And then it sort of held in those 130s for probably until about April. It was the high 130s, low 140s, but still good, with that really low dose. So I increased it to 1200 milligrams in April. And I just got the results back like 2 days ago because I hadn't done my blood work since April. 109. And I was really thrilled that LDL is at 109. And so, granted, red yeast rice does have statin-like effects. It is it's basically a natural supplement. It's a natural statin versus taking a statin drug. But I felt better taking red yeast rice than actually taking a prescription statin. And so that was sort of my option or my decision to do. And yeah, so I was really happy with the outcome there. Sharing it here for the first time.
That's such a great story to hear, because it shows how you tried a bunch of things, and it also shows how everyone is unique, and what works for one person might not work for another person. So it's important to stick to it and to keep trying things. I'm so glad that you got that reduction. It's an impressive cholesterol level.
So excited about it. Yes. Thank you. And it's also, I'm grateful to the providers that I work with, because, it's a traditional primary care doc and cardiologist. Both of them said, though we respect and we understand that if that's not something you want to do, you don't want to take a statin and you want to try this, they supported that route. And so, yeah, I was grateful for that. So still kind of in the same line of conversation. We talked hypertension a bit. We talked cholesterol a bit. Talk to us about foods and their impact specifically on reduction in our cardiovascular events, reduction in risk of cardiovascular events.
Yeah, I have a great patient story for this, because I had a patient who came, and there's obviously this medication around. I'm not going to name it. It's a GLP-1 semaglutide medication that everybody's talking about for weight loss.
Can I say it? And
he kind of came in and he was like, look.
Ozempic.
Okay, you can say it. Yeah, sure. Okay, we're talking about Ozempic.
We're talking about this.
Okay, so a patient came in and he was like, I want to, I have a family history of heart disease. I want to do what I can do, and I'm not afraid of taking medications. But he came to me and he said, should I take this medication to reduce my risk of heart disease? And his specific question was, or can I get that reduction any other way? And I was like, oh, you've come to the right place. This is exactly what I love to talk about. And I showed him the data. I said, look, New England Journal of Medicine, trial of Ozempic shows a 20% reduction in the risk of cardiac events. So that's things like heart attacks, strokes, that sort of thing. 20% is a great reduction. However, if you look at another study published in the New England Journal, which is a cohort testing the effects of the Mediterranean diet, what they found is that the Mediterranean diet enabled a reduction of 30% risk for cardiac events. So very prestigious journals comparing diet, look up a separate article looking at medications. And what you could see is that overall changing your diet actually has a bigger risk reduction. So I gave that patient that information. He was like, okay, now I know what I need to do. And he went forth. And so, or, for other people, it might be a matter of taking the medication and changing your diet. I mean,
Right.
whatever works for that patient in question. I'm all about meeting people where they're at and just supporting them in their goals. But it is impressive to know that. And it also makes sense because taking an injection once a week, it's kind of like it's easy. But if you put in more work and eat those foods and make those foods for yourself consistently, you're going to get an even greater benefit. So it is worth that investment, and it is all that worth. You can get an even higher reduction in your risk for a heart attack.
And like you said, if someone is still choosing to take the medications, the GLP-1s, the Ozempics are similar, making sure that they're following through with also nourishing their body with these really wholesome foods. It's, and sometimes that can become a little complicated because if someone's taking these medications, their appetite changes, what's appealing to them may change. And so if you have made the decision to do that, reach out to a dietitian to provide that guidance. And if you are finding that, man, I don't really have the appetite that I did, we need to make sure that you're nourishing your body with foods that are going to give you the protein, give you the core nutrients that you need. And so if you are limited in what's appealing or what's kind of sitting well, we can definitely still help you navigate that. But it's not just I'm losing the weight, so things are better. We also want to make sure that what we're putting in our body is going to help support that as well. Next, maybe we hop over to diabetes risk of our approach of how we eat, or specifically you're looking at the timing and how we eat compared to the effect of diabetes medications.
There are so many different dietary strategies for improving blood sugar. So again, when I work with patients, it's all about finding the strategy that works best for that individual in front of me. But one of the most impressive studies that I've seen for diabetes looked at type 2 diabetics who had been diagnosed in the last 5 years, and they were all above target for their blood sugar level. So they had what we call A1Cs of 8. Ideally, you want your A1C to be less than 7. And what they did is they basically put them on a time-restricted eating protocol for 12 weeks. And what they did is they ate all their food between 8 a.m. and 6 p.m. So it's pretty reasonable. It's not the most restrictive fasting protocol. You just close that eating window pretty early every night. And what they showed is at the end of the 12 weeks, their reduction in the magnitude of their A1C went down by 1.54 units. So when you compare that to metformin, which is the medication that we give all diabetics when they get diagnosed with diabetes, that's about a 1.3, I believe off the top of my head, reduction. So what it shows you is just changing the time when you're eating and restricting that eating window can lower your blood sugar as much as that medication that we prescribe. Now, it is important to recognize that there is a caveat here, which is that when you decrease someone's eating window, you often automatically also decrease the total number of calories that you're eating. And that just happens because you have less time to eat in each day. So in this study, they did eat about 500 fewer calories per day. So there is that factor as well. Nevertheless, I think it's just such an impressive finding. And I love this because with these sorts of protocols, I don't have to change everything about what someone's eating. It's just about changing that eating window, and you can have such a remarkable benefit. And it's because our body follows a circadian rhythm. And there's certain times of the day when the body handles carbohydrates and sugar better, and that is earlier in the day. So you want to eat your carbs earlier in the day instead of later in the day. In fact, when you compare, say, a bowl of pasta at lunch and a bowl of pasta at dinner, same food, different time of day, completely different blood sugar spike. There's like a 20 to 30% lower blood sugar spike when you eat that pasta at lunch compared to when you eat it at dinner. So same food, different time of day, different outcome. And that's what this time-restricted eating window does, is it cuts you off after 6 p.m. when your body doesn't really want to be focused on carbohydrates anymore. So it works well with our circadian rhythm. Some patients will have good benefits with other time-restricted protocols. I've met those patients. I know that it's real, and I know that it's true, and the studies show it as well. I like this protocol, though, because it aligns with our circadian rhythm so beautifully.
And so time restricted eating, if you're, that may not be as familiar a term to people. And what we're talking about is also referred to as intermittent fasting. And so what Dr. Sko is talking about is a really basic 8 to 6. And depending on someone's schedule, that might look more like 10 to 7. What time do you go to sleep at night? But somewhere in that, basically a 10-hour fueling window, 14-hour fasting window with a significant chunk of time between that last time that you're eating and bedtime. And so again, depending on what your schedule is, if you happen to be a person that like you're up till maybe 12 at night for your work schedule is different, maybe yours looks like 10 a.m. to 8 p.m. or whatever that might be. But the idea is to leave at least 3 hours, if not more, between that last meal and bedtime, 3, 4 hours or more. What's interesting too, and the first that I had really given a strong focus, Dr. Sko, to intermittent fasting was when the Bredson protocol for Alzheimer's prevention was looking at the benefits of intermittent fasting, and that was looking at a 12-hour fasting window, but giving that at least that 3 hour window between your last meal and bedtime, and at least 12 hours, 14 hours is even better, between when that last time is you're eating and the next time you're eating the next day. So that 12-hour fasting window, in this case 14 would be even stronger, that window between last time you're eating and bedtime, help to reduce the formation of the plaques in the brain that are linked to Alzheimer's. And so when I saw that, and this was, gosh, I don't know, maybe a decade ago, maybe a little bit more, it actually had me start to look at intermittent fasting through a different lens and really we did, small pilot tests with different people and had them test different markers. And it was really impressive, the difference we saw in body composition and blood pressure and all these other things without really making these other big efforts and big changes, except the timing there. So the timing can vary a little bit, make it fit with what works for you. And we have done entire podcasts on intermittent fasting, so you can always kind of scroll back and listen to those, but I'm a big fan of it. Is that something that you've done personally?
Totally. Yeah. Once you see that evidence, it's impossible not to want to incorporate that and reap
Yeah.
its benefits. And, even from my own personal experience, maybe it doesn't happen every day of the week. Sometimes I work till 8 p.m. So like I just can't close that eating window as early as I want
Right.
to. But the more that you can adhere to that principle. And the other thing is also just front loading your day. If you can't close that window, then you want to make dinner your smaller meal of the day and lunch and breakfast your bigger meals. That's another way to kind of like make it work on those days when maybe you work too late and it just does not work.
You also mentioned the difference of, that bowl of pasta at lunch versus that bowl of pasta at night. If someone is, for our listeners, and then also just you with your patients, I'm sure the access to a continuous glucose monitor is huge. And so I love, I've played around with those. There's some that NutriSense has a really beautiful platform, a beautiful app. It's super interactive, but it's also pricey. It's over $300 for a month, which is 2 sensors. Or like Abbott has, if your physician is prescribing your continuous glucose monitor, you can pick it up from a pharmacy, and it would be not more than $70 for 2 sensors for that month. And now there's over-the-counter versions of them, Lingo and others that are over the counter. And what's really cool is it lets you see your glucose levels in real time. So if you're listening to Dr. Sko and you're like, but really, is there really that much of a difference between if I had that pasta at lunch and at night? Yes. And speaking from experience, when I played around with that, I had 15 grams of carbs from like 2 little gluten-free cookies that we had, something for a TV segment. And they were 15 grams of carbs, like 7.5 grams of carbs each. So it'd be like the slice of bread. And I had those as a nighttime snack. And my glucose was in the 140s for about 6 hours through my sleep. And I thought that can't be right. And I did it the next day. But when I had them in the daytime, because you're moving, because your muscles are using this carbohydrate, your body is using this, totally different. And so it had me shift right at that moment. Like, wow, what I thought was just a benign little, oh, it's so small, nighttime snack was actually leaving those glucose levels running high, pro-inflammatory, all of these things at night. So there's the time restricted eating, or intermittent fasting as we want to call it. And then also your timing of when you might place those carbohydrates all have that really big impact on our glucose levels, and can have as significant of an impact as a drug like metformin.
Migraines and headaches are one of those things that walk into my clinic every day. And migraines and headaches are terrible because, they're not debilitate. They're not like the kind of, they're not a disease, but they are very debilitating and they rob people of their quality of life. So I'm always trying to optimize quality of life for these patients. And in my studies actually on seed oils, I came across this randomized controlled trial that was done not too long ago where they basically had three arms. They took patients and they had them on the standard American diet with a standard amount of omega-6 fatty acids and omega-3s. Then they had a group where they just increased their omega-3 fatty acid intakes. And then they had a third group where they increased their omega-3s and decreased their omega-6 intakes. And what they found was that if you just increase your omega-3s, you have about 2 fewer migraine days per month. And if you increase your omega-3s and decrease your omega-6s at the same time, you have a 4 fewer migraine days per month, which is impressive because the latest medications that are very expensive for treating migraine on average only decrease migraines by 2 days per month. Now, I do have to acknowledge this. I've talked about this with a lot of patients, and a lot of patients are like, well, that's not the best way to really characterize the benefit because, for example, they might take this medication and they're like, it doesn't decrease the number of days where I have a migraine, but it does lower the overall intensity. So again, it's not to say, these medications don't work and diet is necessarily better, but it just shows that there is this huge potential benefit that can be gained from changing diet. And maybe you do that in complement with the medication, because at the end of the day, I just want patients to feel better. And I want them to live high quality lives where they're not burdened by symptoms like a headache or a migraine. So I was really encouraged by this. I just think it's fascinating. And I also have to say, I just have so much time and so much effort to do these trials and to do them well. And I'm so encouraged every time I see a beautiful trial like this that demonstrates something so well that then I can confidently share with my patients.
All right. So I know that we've got just a little bit of time left. These last two, I think, are tremendous. So, and they kind of, both of them dealing with mental health, mental well-being. So, which do you want to start with? Do you want to start with cognitive impact? Okay.
So it's really interesting. We have these medications that we can give patients to slow the progression of dementia. However, a lot of the doctors that were my mentors and that taught me, they were like, these medications don't really work that well. Some people give them with the hope that they'll do something, but they really don't have a huge benefit for patients. And I was wondering, there was all these studies coming out looking at diet and dementia. And I thought, okay, so the medications don't really work. Can I offer patients something else? How does diet impact it? And it's interesting because when you look at this thing called the mini mental status exam, which is like a validated marker of cognitive function, on average, the medications improve the score by 1 point, which according to those markers and that validated score, that is supposed to be clinically significant. And then when you look at trials of, say, like the Mediterranean diet can also increase those scores by 1 point. So this means it means that both of these strategies do very, very little, or both of these strategies have the same effect. I will say, when I think about cognitive decline, I think about it as a process that has been going on for decades. And we have research that shows that the leafy greens you eat in your 40s predict your cognitive function in your 70s. So it's not to say that if you change someone's diet at the last minute, it's going to ultimately change everything. But again, if you want to do everything you possibly can to intervene when you have that sort of diagnosis or challenge, there is some evidence to say that diet can have some effect, and it's roughly the same as your medication options at that stage.
And the other that's also still kind of in the cognitive space, but a little bit more is in our mental well-being is more related to depression and anxiety. I think this one is tremendous. And I feel like we're just beginning to understand the impact of food. And we always have used, food and mood, but I don't think I think we're just now starting to understand, and the conversation's just starting to become a little bit more common about how foods are influencing, for better or for worse, things like anxiety and depression.
Absolutely. I remember about a decade ago when the first trials about nutrition and mental health were coming out. And the original trial was called the SMILES trial, which was the acronym that they used. Yeah.
Perfect,
and I remember reading the protocol and waiting for this data. And now in the last decade, so many trials have been done, and they consistently show that diet quality can significantly impact mental health, particularly depression and anxiety. And when you do that comparison, in one particular study where they outlined it very nicely, they showed that on average, by adopting the Mediterranean diet, patients with moderate to severe depression, they were already on medication, but it wasn't working. They were able to put their depression into remission. 36% of them were able to put their depression into remission just by changing their diet. So I think that is remarkable. And the reason I think that's remarkable is because in medical school, we're taught about this thing called the rule of thirds. And the rule of thirds is basically this principle that dictates when you start someone on a medication, 1/3 of people will be cured, 1/3 of people will have a partial response, and 1/3 of people will have no response. And this rule was particularly taught to us in the realm of antidepressants. We know that antidepressants work very well for some patients, but they don't necessarily work as well for everyone. Sometimes there's the solution, sometimes they're not. And when you see that 1/3 of patients can get better with diet and 1/3 of patients can get better with medications, it just shows that we have to have every tool in the toolkit when we're trying to help someone who's struggling with mental health, because it is complicated. There are so many factors. And if we can control every factor that is within our grasp to control, I think it's worthwhile because it can help that individual overcome the struggle that they're currently facing.
And the side by side that you have for this one is, as you said, the Mediterranean diet, that incorporating that, which it's vegetables, whole grains, olive oil, oily fish like salmon, our beans, nuts, seeds, things like Greek yogurt, that incorporating that Mediterranean diet, the reduction in depression, looking at about 36% of the patients, and then looking at a traditional medication, about also the same 35%. So in addition to that, we were talking earlier about kind of the benefit of encouraging people to add things in, because the more we're adding in the emphasis on these positives, it's edging out the other stuff that's not so good for us. And in this case, the ultra processed foods, the things that are high in refined carbohydrates, the snack foods, the chips, the cookies, the things that are easy at our fingertips. They're in vending machines, office kitchens. They're the stuff that we pick up at a convenience store on a, if you're stopping to get gas and, I'm going to get myself a little snack. It's what's in coffee shops. It's the food that's in all of these places. Those ultra processed foods are linked to that increase in anxiety. And so we're not saying that, add in fish and olive oil and cut back on, your pretzels and Fritos is going to make that change in anxiety or depression. But going back to what Dr. Sko said earlier of, let me do everything I can. Let me do everything that's possible in my power to make these changes. And when we are struggling with something like anxiety or depression, and we are, we may need that medication, we're going to opt for that medication. We've worked with our providers. That's maybe the best case for us, the best scenario for us. Let's also help those outcomes by making these nutritional changes. I think of friends of mine over the years who really struggled with these conditions, anxiety, depression, different varying degrees. And when I would look at the behaviors, very low physical movement, staying indoors all the time, not having that exposure to natural light, the outdoors, the green that we also know is also so important in reducing these things, but also a steady diet of soft drinks, steady diet of Coca-Cola, of white refined everything. And so when we look at those, while the medications may be something that's going to be a necessity, it might be life-saving in some points. Also, let's layer in adding these things in that can help us. And then also, what am I doing that might be really hurting this? And so I think that to me is one where in real time, almost, we can see how what we're eating is affecting us. Something like blood pressure or cholesterol, maybe we don't feel it right in the moment. You're making these changes, and it might take several weeks or months to even show up in our blood work or to show up in whatever these metrics are. But how we're feeling in that moment, starting to really tune in, and I think that can be a driver for how motivated we can feel to make those healthier choices right now. I also think it's interesting, as we were talking about these, and we started out in the very beginning, some of these things that we talked about for blood pressure and cholesterol also have these whole body benefits. Well, as we're talking about the things that you were saying, the omega-3s, that movement, nuts, seeds, not only are they benefit the hypertension, cholesterol, also inflammation, anxiety, depression. I mean, the list just goes on there, cognitive health. And then so many of the things like there's one, if you're adding just those omega-3s, the benefit on that it's going to have, it's all of these that we've talked about can be benefited by upping our omega-3 content pretty much. So any last things that we want to kind of sum it up for people of where to go from here?
I think the most important message that I can give people is that it's not as complicated as it always seems. In 500 BC, Plato spoke about nutrition. He said a healthy diet, consists of like wheat and leafy greens and vegetables and all those things. And he said treats to be avoided in moderation are like wine and confectionaries. And I always say, like, 2,000 years later, nothing's really changed. Healthy
What's changed
eating
is we have
simple.
more of it out there for people.
Yes. Yeah. It's like, it is that simple. And really, it is about making those small changes over time. Eating, the common sense thing that your grandmother would tell you is usually the thing to do. It doesn't always take, I love digging into the literature, but half the time the literature reaffirms those things that most of us already know. And it's a matter of just making that commitment. And when you fall off the horse, you get back on and you recommit to those habits, because we all fall off the bandwagon sometimes. And just know that the food you eat every day has as much potential as the medications that I went to school for a very long time to be able to prescribe. But I can truly say that, diet can be as effective as medication in so many different contexts. So it's wonderful news and it's empowering. And I hope that everyone can just take that information and use it to transform their lives and live their best life ever.
Have open conversations with your providers, have open conversations about when you do want to make these changes, these lifestyle changes, movement, nutrition, and ask when it's possible. If you haven't started that medication yet, ask if you can have that 3-month window. Can I make these lifestyle changes? The answer may be no. It might be so critical you need to start that medication right away. So ask, have that conversation, be open. Can I get a 3-month reprieve? Can I try this with lifestyle? Let me see how much change I can bring about. If you are already on this medication for what that condition is, when it's something that's going to be readily and easily measurable, check that on the regular so that you can know, okay, I'm on this medication, but can I dial back the amount of medication? Maybe I'm able to come off of some of it or all of it with these changes. And I think it all comes back to having these very open and honest conversations with your provider, and also asking providers to listen and support whenever you do have patients who are really wanting to be active in that and proactive, and helping them to see and measure when possible how much of a difference these changes are making to support it. So thank you so much for your time, Dr. Sko.
Always a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So grateful to Dr. Sko for joining us today. As we mentioned, we'll include the links that we talked about in the show notes of this episode. And always let me know what you think as you incorporate some of these strategies into your own life. I always want to hear about it. I am registered dietitian Molly Kimball, and you've been listening to Fueled Wellness and Nutrition, the podcast. If you'd like more Fueled Wellness and Nutrition, please head over to mollykimball.com, and you can follow me, Molly Kimball RD, on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. And if you haven't yet, please go to Apple Podcasts and subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. Join us next time for another dose of Fueled Wellness and Nutrition. Thanks for listening, and stay focused on living your strongest, healthiest life